Okay, let's remember to not speak loudly. Welcome to the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies. My name is Emma Rosie Marshall. I'm a scientist here at the Carey Institute. I'm an aquatic ecologist. Bill Schlesinger is not here today. He's down in D.C. He had a meeting he had to attend, so he was sorry to miss the presentation tonight. For those of you who are new to the Carey Institute and haven't been to one of these lectures before, we're a not-for-profit organization focused on environmental sciences and ecosystem science, and we do research on things ranging from invasive species to climate change to water quality, and so we're happy to have you here today. Each month we offer a public program, as people probably know, with the goal of engaging the community in environmental thinking. And these events are made possible by the Aldo Leopold Society. So if you enjoy these events and would like to see them continue, please consider joining the Aldo Leopold Society. There's information out there if you're interested. This evening we're really honored to have John Jarvis here. He's the head of the National Park Service, the director of the National Park Service. He's going to be discussing how the Park Service is addressing climate change, threats to some of America's greatest landscapes. Mr. Jarvis has a really distinguished record of service in the Park Service, and I got to read through all the places he's been, and it's sort of a wish list of places that I'm sure all of us would love to travel someday. I hope that people in the audience have had the pleasure of visiting some of our national parks, either close to home or far away. I've had the pleasure of doing research. I've had the honor of doing research in some of our nation's most amazing national parks, in my opinion. So Grand Canyon is one of them that maybe some of you heard me talk about in a previous one of these Friday night lectures. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Jarvis. I know he's got some great visions for the future that he's going to talk about tonight. So thank you so much for coming.
Well, thanks, Emma. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you all for coming out tonight, in spite of the storm that's looming in on the area. I'm sure we'll all make it home tonight without any problem. I won't, though, I'm sure. First, I'd just like to thank Tom Lovejoy for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here and a privilege. And I'd like to also commend the work of the Carey Institute. This is really very much the same kind of work that the National Park Service does. You know, your concerns are our concerns, and I think this is more true now than perhaps any other time in the past. The National Park Service was established in 1916 to protect this country's greatest natural places, and it was later expanded to include our historic and cultural sites, battlefields and presidential homes and Anasazi cliff dwellings and long-distance trails and other reminders of our collective past, and really they all contain lessons for the future as well. Today, the National Park System is comprised of 398 parks and monuments, 84 million acres of mountains, forests, deserts, wetlands, prairies, and coral reefs. We have 11,000 miles of coastline and 2.5 million acres of ocean. Our museum collections are second only to the Smithsonian, and we have been characterized as the largest informal education institution in the country. Our national parks are great reserves of biodiversity. They're home to threatened and endangered species, and in many ways the last large natural North American landscapes where the ecosystems are relatively intact, certainly not perfect. In 2016, the National Park Service will be 100 years old. It'll be our centennial. And we have a lot to celebrate about that. The United States has really originated this idea. We were the first to try this experiment of setting aside big pieces of the natural landscape for the people. Been done in other parts of the world, but it was set aside for royalty, not for the people. Ken Burns, if you've seen his PBS special on the national parks, said that the national parks are the Declaration of Independence applied to the landscape, because regardless of your ethnicity or your economic status, you can stand shoulder to shoulder along the rim of the Grand Canyon. And since 1916, we've really become recognized as an international leader in conservation. recognized the world over, not only for what we do, but why we do it and how we do it. I serve on a little, what I call our World Protected Areas Self-Help Group. We have about 8 or 10 directors from all over the world. We get together once a year to sort of commiserate about our problems that we have. One of my very good friends in Africa loves telling me the story that he has this problem where the village right outside his park builds their huts out of grass, and the elephants come out and eat their huts. And I said, I don't have that problem. You know, our second century of stewardship and public engagement of the National Park Service is going to be fraught with many challenges. Pollution, encroaching development, invasive species, all threaten the national parks. But I believe the greatest threat is climate change. And I've been with the National Park Service for almost 40 years. I was a chief biologist at Crater Lake National Park and at North Cascades. I was superintendent of Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve in Alaska, 13 million acres, largest one in the system. Mount Rainier National Park and Craters of the Moon. And I served as the regional director for the Pacific West region of the National Park Service for 7 years before becoming director, and that's all of the Pacific states. I've spent a lot of time in the field, getting to know parks really at the ground level. And I've seen climate change in action, and I want to share some of that with you. The glaciers in Mount Rainier and Olympic and North Cascades are all receding. There are more rain-on-snow events in these parks, often causing extraordinary flooding. There's less snow in the Sierras, and what snow does fall has much lower water content than in the past. Lake Mead, Lake Powell, all fed by the Colorado River in the desert Southwest, are at record lows. Wildfires in the West are now burning 20 days longer than any time in history. Just this fall, I had a wildfire burning in Rocky Mountain National Park in October underneath snow. Species are migrating to higher elevations, and alpine habitats are disappearing. In Bandelier and Rocky Mountain National Parks, drought is killing the pine forests, as are the bark beetles, which are now overwintering because of warmer winters. We're seeing changes in bird migration, in mammal range, and in plant dormancy. Rising sea temperatures are bleaching coral reefs in our parks in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. And in the Everglades, rising seas will eventually march the mangroves into the freshwater wetlands. Some of our national parks are even predicted to lose their signature treasures. Glaciers for which Glacier National Park was named are now predicted to be gone within 20 years. Some of our scientists tell me that Joshua Tree National Park may one day no longer contain Joshua trees. And the saguaro and the giant sequoia are threatened in their namesake parks as well. And the effects of climate change are not limited to natural resources. Rising sea levels and acidification affect both historic and cultural sites as well. The spectacular 19th century Fort Jefferson on the tip end of the Florida Keys in Dry Tortugas is being steadily encroached upon by the surrounding sea. And more and frequent and intense wildfires are exposing and destroying archaeological sites throughout our parks in the West. And on top of it, our own physical infrastructure, the systems that we have built over the years to provide access and opportunity for you are all undergoing changes from climate change. A few years ago, we had 18 inches of rain fell in a 36-hour period at Mount Rainier National Park, and it fell in the fall on snow. Well, if you have rain on snow in the spring, it's like a big sponge. It just sort of soaks it up and lets it out gently. If you have rain on snow in the fall, it comes down as a torrent. The Nisqually River breached its levees, and the Sunshine Point campground was gone. It was scoured to bedrock. And the park entrance road was washed out in 4 places. One of them was a 70-foot deep gash. We lost 25 bridges and crossings. We had 3 feet of silt deposited on the roots of the ancient western red cedars that we call the Grove of the Patriarchs. Cost around $36 million to repair. And then all of you know, just at the end of last year, a southern hurricane combined with a nor'easter and a high tide and hit New York and New Jersey, wiping out many homes and businesses along the shoreline and in downtown New York City. A lot of that beach and barrier islands and places are managed by the National Park Service as part of Gateway, Fire Island, Statue of Liberty, and others. We had sustained about $400 million worth of damage to that, all of those facilities. Most of our utility systems all went underwater, including those at Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty. I'm working to get them open, by the way. I served as the lead for the Department of the Interior for the Hurricane Sandy recovery. And one thing that we have all agreed to, that this storm is the new normal, that this was not a one-off. We need to prepare for these kind of intense storms, storm surge and sea level rise for the future. Every employee in the National Park Service that is joining now, for the rest of their career, they will be dealing with climate change. And the implications are really profound in terms of training and scientific literacy. In the larger scheme of things, in terms of land management, these challenges are not only complex, but without precedent. As daunting as all that may sound, we're not just sitting around letting it happen. We have a response, and it really is well underway. Our climate change response program is really a strategic approach that we've spent a great deal of time and resources formulating. More than anything, we are realistic about the situation, that climate change is not going to go away, and that we also know that the national parks serve as some of the best laboratories in which to observe climate change and its effects. And it can help us define what we're going to do about it. So let me sort of characterize the 4 sort of big buckets that our approaches defines our approach to climate change. First is dependence on really good science. Second is adaptation to an uncertain future. Third is mitigation in terms of the effects of climate change through reducing our own carbon footprint. And lastly, but not least important, is that we can serve as an educational resource to reach out to the public and the rest of the world. So let's start with science. We've been really working to sort of institutionalize our capacity and our scientific literacy. And we're working not only with our own in-house National Park Service scientists, but working with scientists across the full spectrum, both government like USGS and NOAA, with universities and with NGOs as well. And our aim is to really deliver the very best, most current science available to inform the decisions we really have to make. We are managing lands on a day-to-day basis and resources, and we have decisions. We can't wait. So we need the very best science that is available to make those decisions. And that means working with climate change models, testing them, and applying them to the various types of work that we do. That is the best we can do to anticipate the changes that we might see in the future and really prepare for multiple futures in all of our parks. Let me give an example. Assateague Island National Seashore has the very, very famous wild ponies, Misty and Chincoteague, if you remember. They're absolutely one of the most loved features of the park. But climate change could absolutely alter the availability of fresh water on Assateague. Rising sea levels and changes in precipitation, fresh water could basically disappear from Assateague. So anticipating that scenario is a part of our planning process. We've really begun a long-term monitoring of groundwater on Assateague, and that will help us understand how to adjust to this change. At Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota, one of its cultural icons is the wild herd of bison, one of the only 4 free roaming bison herds on public lands in North America. As temperatures are going to get warmer, the range of vegetation shifts. We see the grasslands and forest interface changing significantly, which we think will cause the bison to leave and move out of this refuge that has been created for them. And where they go may be a challenge for them, and they're very, very important to our genetic diversity. Climate change models can help us begin to plan for that and determine the routes of migration and new places that these species can go. For years now, the Park Service has been engaged in a very ambitious inventory monitoring program, not only of our natural resources, but our cultural resources as well. It's not very sexy, but it's incredibly important to get this sort of baseline to really an idea of the health and stability, or lack thereof, in these national park systems as well. And we're trying to develop that data and share it, give it to all that are out there to utilize, to monitor, or to analyze these long-term effects as well. Adaptation. Adaptation is really going to be critical as to how we deal with climate change. It's going to become part of essentially everything that we do, from wildlife management to how we build our facilities. And we are building it into all levels of planning within the National Park Service. Even our own official policies and rules and regulations are going to have to be adjusted and adapted to climate change. Some of them will have to be abandoned and new ones will have to be developed. We're developing a whole, to a certain degree, more fluid approach to the big picture, thinking at the landscape level as we act within our own boundaries. For example, as I mentioned earlier, when a group of us were sitting around, my chief scientist out in California when I was there said, "Are you ready to put a sprinkler system on the giant sequoias?" I said, "Not yet." But think about that. The giant sequoias exist only in a small niche environment in the Sierras. You go too high, they don't exist. You go too low, they don't exist. They're pretty hard to move. They're kind of big. But do we help them persist in that environment? Or do we predict where they may need to be 500 years from now, and we go plant them in the Southern Cascades? These are hard questions. Not sure I have an answer to it, but we've got to start talking about it. What about those species that suddenly show up in a national park? Our traditional policies would be that we would kill them if they showed up, if they were exotics. But perhaps now the park may be its last refuge, and we need to no longer treat them as exotics. One of the ways that we're approaching this whole adaptation is really promoting resilience into the system. And we're looking to really improve the ecosystem's capacity to withstand change and still keep their sort of inherent characteristics. This is really going to be a new sort of approach to how we manage our national parks. It really calls almost for a fundamental reevaluation of who we are as stewards of these places. We also have to think about adaptation in terms of our cultural resources. Cultural resources don't migrate. They're usually right there. Erosion and flooding and a wetter, more volatile environment overall will cause us to improvise in terms of how we manage our cultural resources. So for instance, documentation of petroglyphs along the coastal environment is becoming a higher priority because we are going to lose them with sea level rise. Mitigation. You know, the Park Service isn't a big footprint, but we can still do some things in terms of our own carbon footprint. We can certainly demonstrate to the American people and to the world that we are exemplars in terms of our own sustainability. So we have set specific targets that actually exceed all of the government standards for our own in-house operations. Sustainability has become a priority throughout all of our business practices, our travel, our contracts, our purchasing, our facilities, our operations. We have a Green Parks Plan, which you can pull up on the web, it's available, And it really is about building sustainability into all of our park operations and reducing our overall carbon footprint. And you can get multiple benefits from that. We recently, at Big Bend National Park in Texas, in partnership with a lighting company called Musco Lighting, which is the company that relit the Statue of Liberty here recently for us, we relamped the entire park and achieved several things. One is we saved a lot of money because they used new modern LED lighting, but we also restored the night sky at the same time. And Big Bend now with this restored lighting is one of the darkest places in the United States, and just received designation as an international dark sky park, which, believe it or not, will attract astro tourists. They come with their telescopes. But it's really important for us to demonstrate our own sustainability, but even more important is to talk about it to the public and not just hide it behind the scenes. So we've really made many of our new public facilities, like our visitor centers, LEED certified, LEED Platinum. We've got several now that are LEED Platinum, including the visitor center at Grand Teton National Park. The building uses geothermal and solar energy, light sensors, composting bathrooms, and that saves about 76,000 gallons of water from the past. I was involved in replacing the visitor center at Mount Rainier, where we downsized it by 2/3, and this is in a tough location. It's an area that gets about 800 inches of snowfall a year. So it's a highly energy efficient building. Still needs cooling, which we now cool with snow melt water. And everything from recycled glass tiles to carpet to reusable materials, natural lighting, natural cooling, all of those, even hybrid vehicles, biofuels, have all become part of our operations. One of the biggest energy users in the national park system, of course, are people in their own cars. And so we're instituting transportation systems, whether it's Yosemite or the Grand Canyon or Glacier National Park. Even the old historic red buses that we were restored with a donation from Ford Motor Company are now running on alternative fuels. Now, solar energy is an interesting controversy within the Park Service because solar takes up a lot of space, and not every park can accommodate it. But if you go to Alcatraz Island now, the cell block, you won't see it, but the whole roof is covered with solar panels. In Death Valley, perfect place to get solar. We have the largest solar array that's powering most of the operations for the concessions there as well. We're conducting energy and water audits throughout the system, and we're talking about it to the American public with the hope that it inspires you and everyone else to recognize that there is something that you can do at home. We're also playing a big part. The Department of Interior has a big interest, along with the U.S. Forest Service, in using our public lands for carbon storage, and we are looking to all kinds of ideas around that as well. We host about 270 million visitors a year to the national parks, and that's a little less than the population of the United States, but it's a big number. That is an incredible opportunity for education. Visitors, come to the national parks with a certain level of expectation to obviously get outside, see something, have some fun, but also to learn something. And they have a high degree of respect of the National Park Ranger to deliver them the unfettered truth about these places. It's a great opportunity to talk about sustainability. It's a great time to talk about climate change as well. And then they can actually see it on the ground and learn about it right before their eyes, then based on good science. So we are training our interpreters to talk about climate change. We have a climate change action plan where we bring science and policy to the ground. This is really where the whole theory meets practice as well. We just released it this year. You can pull that up on the web as well. It's really intended as a sort of a practical guide for individual parks out there that they can pick and choose all kinds of things to take on. It has a lot of flexibility, a little bit of ingenuity, and a lot of it is based on education, both inside our own organization as well as with our partners and the public as well. It requires us to train our new employees, train our superintendents, how to use science, how to use best practices, and how to share experiences across the entire system. We're also focused on young people, and we have the George Melendez Wright Climate Change Youth Initiative, which is a cooperative agreement that we started in 2010 with the University of Washington. This is bringing students directly into national parks in internships where they can actually conduct their own independent research on climate change as well. We benefit, they benefit, and they develop a new cadre of professionals that will be moving into the future and help us deal with these challenges as well. We are encouraging scientists to come and work in our parks as well to help us understand the impacts both in cultural and natural resources in terms of climate change as well. And there's certainly been a history in the past of us being more resistant to that, and we are breaking that down. You know, climate change is way too complex for just the National Park Service to be taking on as well. So we are really addressing this, in my view, at a landscape scale for the very first time. If there's any silver lining out here, we're finally beginning to look at a collaboration at the landscape scale, federal, state, tribal, private, academic, across the board. We have this national network of cooperative ecosystem study units that are based at, I believe, 18 or 19 universities. There's really a national consortium for these variety of institutions to work together, and we are giving them the new charge around climate change to bring scientists and land managers and academics and students and conservation professionals and cultural resource scholars all together, all disciplines, including the social sciences as well, and engineering, to really look biogeographically within a region and tackle these complex issues with the very best new ideas as well. I mentioned really for the very first time in my almost 40 years, the land management agencies, the federal land management agencies, and there are 4 of us, not counting Department of Defense. You have the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Forest Service. And between the 4 of us, we manage 30% of the land mass of the United States. And never in my history have we sat down together around the same table and talked about landscape conservation. But we're doing it now. We've been doing it since 2009. And we have some funding. This is your money. It's coming from the Outer Continental Shelf Oil Leasing Program. So it's revenues, it's not taxes. It's revenues from this oil leasing. Goes into the Land and Water Conservation Fund, reappropriated by Congress, with the potential to be up to $900 million a year. It's never quite been that much, but nevertheless, whatever we get, we are sitting down and saying, at the landscape scale, within the Continental Divide, or within the California desert, or within the longleaf pine of the southeast, what properties need to remain either in some level of conservation? What working landscapes could remain working landscapes but with a conservation ethic over it? What lands should be turned into parklands or forest lands or others that create connectivity on the landscape, that allow species to migrate, that will be pushed by climate change as well? And this is really unprecedented. And I think it's a fantastic effort to really put action on the ground. And what's fascinating, we've been working on this actually longer than this most recent thing in one area, and that is what's called the Crown of the Continent. It's the Glacier, Rocky Mountain front lands, the Blackfoot Range, and there's been a big coalition working somewhat independently, land trusts and others up there. And we believe with about 2 years more of investment, about $100 million, the Crown of the Continent will be ecologically sustainable forever. that we've nailed it. We've got all the corridors down. We've got working landscapes with conservation easements over them. We've got the right pieces of river and mountain and valley all connected up, that it will be sustainable. And that's our goal for many of these other ecosystems that we're working in as well. If you go back to the origins of the national parks, it was 1916. There was really an emphasis on the big parks. It was about access and tourism and promotion. The first director of the National Park Service was a fantastic marketing guy. He worked for the borax mines, and he knew he had to get public support, so he strongly promoted our national parks. It took a while for us to really begin to get into a science-based management program that sort of started somewhat in the 30s and built up into the 60s. And in 1963, there was kind of a watershed moment in the National Park Service. There was recognized that we had way too many elk in Yellowstone and the Grand Tetons. And the National Park Service decided to shoot them. Well, elk were very popular in those days. We didn't quite have the concept down around predators or fire, and elk were good, and mountain lions were bad, and wolves were bad, and deer were good, and it was sort of simplistic. And the Secretary of the Interior charged his science advisor, A. Starker Leopold, although Leopold's son, to put together a little team and go figure this out. And what he came back with is known to us is the Leopold Report. And it's sort of been a cross between the Torah and the first the Bible to the National Park Service for 60 years. It's how we have managed our national parks. What Starker Leopold said was that the national parks should be managed to establish, and this is a quote, vignettes of primitive America. Essentially, pre-European contact. This is what you should do. So restore them. Even if you can't completely restore them, get them to the point that they look like that. It was sort of, and he even said basically that in the Leopold Report. And that was a cultural shift for the National Park Service. We had sort of been managing principally for the public, for public use, and for scenery. And what Leopold said is, the predators are gone, you got to bring them back. If fire was part of the system, you got to reintroduce fire. If the species are exotic, you got to get rid of those. Well, that's been a really good guide for us, but frankly, it's dated. It has served us well for that period of time, but not anymore. So we have revisited the Leopold Report to really look at a strategy that deals with climate change, with invasive species, with encroaching development, with that ecology is not separated from the humans. We are part of the system. And that there are many cultural and natural integrations as a part of the stewardship responsibility. This team that we put together, since we couldn't get A. Starker anymore, we had 2 Nobel laureates, 2 members of the National Academy of Sciences, a former director of the National Science Foundation, a winner of the 2011 National Medal of Science, and leaders in the field from conservation biology to anthropology. And this group included your own Tom Lovejoy. So we really couldn't have asked for a more distinguished team to take on a more demanding assessment of the Leopold Report. And so they have completed it. If you type in Revisit Leopold on the web, it will pop up the report. We saved trees, and we didn't print very many of them. It's available online. So they replaced this paradigm of vignettes of primitive America with the following. The overarching goal of the National Park Service resource management should be to steward resources for continuous change that is not yet fully understood in order to preserve ecological integrity and cultural and historical authenticity, provide visitors with transformative experiences, and form the core of a national conservation land and seascape. Vignettes of Primitive America was a lot easier to envision than that, I have to say. But I think they got it. This concept of continuous change, ecological integrity, and cultural and historical authenticity, and that the public, in having contact with that, will be transformed, and that it is a part of a larger landscape. So we are working right now, including Tom and others, to get this sort of socialized out there within our own community, within our own National Park Service, within our scientific community, within our friends and advocacy groups and volunteers and the public and everybody else, basically this next year. And then we will develop the policies to implement the Revisit Leopold approach. Because it is more complicated, way more complicated. But I think that whatever we do, everything that we do related to climate change is really made more powerful if we use our education capacity within the National Park Service. Our interpreters, and I've got about 2,000, maybe 3,000 interpreters and professional educators in the National Park Service, are way more conversant now than they ever were about climate change. And they're actually fairly comfortable talking about it. And we know from social science that the American public actually want to hear from us about this critical issue. So we're fully engaged. We know that the national park system, the national parks are a beloved American institution. We get millions and millions of visitors, and they check the boxes in terms of their satisfaction with these great places. And I think in order for climate change to become real to the American public, it has to be personal. They have to feel it. They have to see it. And I think national parks are perfect places to show that these places that they love are being affected negatively, right in front of their very eyes. I think we're taking a lot of great actions on this to really prepare us for this uncertain future. But I also think it requires us to take to really develop a culture of risk-taking. There's no silver bullet here. So we must draw on the strengths of the scientific community, of the American public, all of our partners, all of our friends out there to really meet this challenge in the long term. You know, the original concept of national parks was revolutionary. The idea of setting aside large chunks of the American landscape was a forward-thinking idea. And now we are the stewards of those voices, and we have a responsibility to the next set of generations to pass them on to them. And so I think how we respond to climate change has to be just as forward-thinking, just as risk-taking, just as creative as the original idea that established the National Park System to begin with. So thank you. I'd like to take any questions that you might have. Okay, right back in the back, right there. And you go ahead and state it, and I'll repeat it.
I have two questions. One's about interagency cooperation, the other is about political pressure. You talked about high-level cooperation being new. At the more detailed level, surely the National Wildlife Refuge people have to be doing a lot of climate change studies. Are you exchanging scientific information at that level?
So the question, if you didn't hear it, is interagency cooperation, and specifically with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then you had, so I'll answer that one, and then you can ask the political one. Absolutely. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is a sister agency to the National Park Service in the Department of Interior. And I see Director Dan Ash probably 4 times a day. And he and I are collaborating a great deal on climate change. What's interesting, we all have different tools to apply. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a different set of tools than we have in the National Park Service. They can work outside of refuge boundaries. They can use the Endangered Species Act. They can designate critical habitats. They have grant-making programs. So we are all looking to the tools that we have to address this in a much more collaborative manner than in the past. And your second question was about politics.
In visiting the parks, particularly the bookstores, I have found that some scientifically based literature has been banned in various places because of objections. In one place specifically to information on evolution. Are you under pressure to deny climate change in your public space?
No, I have received, and I've been talking openly in public forums about climate change for over a decade, not just since I came to Washington, and I have not once anyone told me to be quiet about it. I'm not aware of any suppression of any scientific information in our national park system. If it's peer-reviewed, legitimate science, we don't suppress it. Okay, who else? Right here.
Everyone cries the fact that these days don't seem to get as much about your science. So I wonder if in your demographic surveys you notice either reduction in young people visiting the parks or reduction in support for the parks amongst your people, because that's obviously.
The question is, do we have the social science to sort of back up the claim that youth are not engaged? It's a great question, because I've asked this of my social science staff, and they would suggest, based on our demographic data, that there are no fewer young people visiting national parks today than there were 20 years ago. What I do think, though, that it's all about the question that you asked and what data you're looking at as well. What we're not seeing in the national parks is the demographic representation of the ethnicity of this country. And when you have certain populations like the Latino community, which is younger and growing, there's a very large growing young people population in the Latino community that Latino Americans, they're not visiting. And that is a problem. We do see, obviously, the way young people use parks is very different. We did in 2010, we did a series of listening sessions around the country. We did 24 of those with young people. You couldn't enter the room if you were over 24 years old. I got to sit in the back a couple of times. But I actually had a 22-year-old running the meetings. And if I asked this group, let's just say this is a general public sort of, park lover kind of group that says, I said, okay, what do you think about technology in the national parks? Do you think that, we'll do a little quick survey here. How many think that an individual, when they go to a national park, should be able to use their iPhone and get wireless pretty much anywhere? How many think that's a good idea? Okay, that's exactly what you would typically find in the audience of this side. If this was everybody under 24, it'd be 90% would have their hands up. And there's an expectation with this new generation that they're going to stay connected and that they're going to share over social media their experiences. And so we're struggling with this, obviously, in land management agencies about how we keep our parks relevant to this new generation. And it's interesting because, we, as my generation of park users, we certainly use some technologies. I mean, I'm not hiking in wool with a wicker pack anymore, okay? And so why are some technologies good and others not, is one of those questions. So I think a lot of our effort around 2016, the centennial, is about engagement of youth and getting them connected, not just to the national park system, but to all of the outdoors for all of its multiple benefits. Back over here, yes, ma'am.
Hi. I'm just wondering about the partitioning of funding that you guys are having to deal with in terms of actually combating this. I mean, you guys have over 84 million acres of land that you manage. And what's fascinating about the Park Service is, is priorities. All the really always been oriented towards public use and, now science as of 1930 that you're speaking about. So how are you dealing with dwindling funding and this millions of dollars going towards climate change mitigation in New York City alone? And what are you having to cut out of your budget going forward?
Yeah, so the question was, show me the money. It's a great question. We are in tough economic times, this country. And the National Park Service, along with the other land management agencies, are in the little sliver of the discretionary portion of the budget. We are in the non-defense, non-homeland security, non-entitlement portion of the budget, which is just a little slice. And that gets divvied up, and we don't get very much of it. Some would say we get more than our fair share if you look at all the land management agencies. But to manage the national park system into the future, we need much more sustainable funding sources. And so, as I like to say, we're a perpetuity institution on an annual appropriation. And as you may notice, and have probably read in the press, we are facing a sequestration on March 1st of 5% of our budget, which is going to result in some significant impacts on the ground. We are operating on a continuing resolution from last year's budget. We don't know whether we're going to have a budget. And so, we launched a major climate change program a few years ago, and then we had to cut it in half almost immediately. And we're not able to hire the climate scientists that we were needing. One of my goals, again, for 2016 is to come up with a different financial model for the National Park Service that protects us from these ups and downs and swings, so that we can have some sustainability. And it's going to be a combination of some appropriations, some philanthropy, some better use of our existing non-appropriated dollars like fees, and some new authorities that allow us to manage all of that with some coherence, because right now it is incoherent, and it results in an unpredictability to both the operation of a park, to the gateway communities, to the businesses that rely on us for day-to-day use, as well as a deep concern to the resources themselves. Right here.
I have a couple baby boomer questions.
You have a couple what?
Baby boomer questions.
Baby boomer questions, okay.
Our travel extent, first I'd like to thank you for the $10 lifetime pass. Secondly, we were in Yellowstone and the Teton last summer. Not this past summer, fall before actually, September, post-Labor Day. The parks were crowded with a lot of people with gray hair. We were camping in campgrounds were closing early, and we were having trouble getting campgrounds. I was wondering if anything's being done to address what I presume our college kids working on these campgrounds who are going back to school in September, leaving us high and dry, driving all over Yellowstone, trying to find a campground. That's the first question. And the second question is, I have many friends who have retired comfortably and are traveling all over the world. And many of them have never been to Glacier or Yellowstone or the Teton or the Grand Canyon or Grand, and I can go on and on and on and on. Is anything being done? I realize there are many budget reasons. Is anything being done to market our parks to people who are flying all over the world? You don't even realize what's here.
Okay, there are two questions there. One was about sort of that shoulder season period when it sort of begins to look like nobody's at home except you. And the second is promotion and marketing for stay at home. I'll take the first one first. I love that season, that period in the national parks because it's, the big tour groups are usually gone. It's sort of more down to the people that really want to be there, and you're there at that shoulder period, and if the fall is coming in, and it is a challenge. A lot of our seasonal help goes home. A lot of it is budget. It's not just necessarily that the folks that are working with us don't want to stay. A lot of them do want to stay. We just don't have the funding to carry them into our seasons have gotten shorter and shorter because of our budget, essentially, and we rely more and more on volunteers who are also ready the snowbirds to get out of there before the season comes. But it's also a time you can have the park to yourself in many ways. In terms of marketing, absolutely. I mentioned we're at 274 million. I think we're actually going to crack 280 million for this past year, but it's pretty much been flat for a decade or more, or hovering between 274 to 282, 282, back and forth, sort of. And that you can attribute to gas prices and a lot of other things. The Organic Act in 1916 that established the National Park Service said the National Park Service shall regulate and promote the national parks for their enjoyment, preservation for future generations. And we haven't done much on the promote, except back in the early days. We really did promote them, and in partnership with the travel and railroad industry and the writers and others. So recognizing that this has flattened out, recognizing that there's a large segment of the American public that don't come. They've had no experience with national parks. Either they're first-generation immigrants, or they haven't had the economic capacity, or they think they're unsafe, or whatever. There are a lot of barriers out there. And young people, probably many of you went to your first national park in the station wagon with your parents, and now you can never get your kids into that. They don't want to do that. Though one of my very favorite cartoons, I wish I had it, shows the family van in Yellowstone, and the parents are out looking at the bison, and the kids are in the van watching a movie about bison. I have a foundation, the National Park Foundation. They are legislatively established philanthropic partner to the Park Service. And we have tasked them to hire a Madison Avenue marketing firm, Gray Advertising. Gray does E-Trade Baby. So if you watch the Super Bowl, you saw the E-Trade Baby cartoon or commercial, that's Gray. We've contracted with them through 2016 to develop a comprehensive public awareness campaign about the national parks for visitation, for volunteerism, for activism, for philanthropy, for involvement, for just basic awareness that these are yours. They belong to you. Come there. You can come. You can see them. You can have great experiences. And Gray is just in the research phase right now. We hope to launch a real creative in probably late 13 into 14. We're looking at targeting young people particularly. So we're looking at associations with sports, with music, with art. We've just cut a deal that the Rose Bowl parade in 2016, the entire Tournament of Roses will be national parks, every float. So we're addressing this issue in a pretty aggressive way to try to really recognize. And I think it's a chicken and egg thing here too with the budget. I mean, you would say, why do you want more people to come if you don't have the budget? But if you don't have more people coming, you're never going to get the budget. It's my belief is that we've got to start a real promotion campaign as well. Yes.
Is there any way to combine mass transit initiatives to get people in large numbers without being in their vehicles, get to national parks, and then be transported by, I don't know, horse and buggy or something?
We do that actually. The question was, is there a way to connect mass transit? There are, a lot of our national parks are pretty remote. So we've stood up our own transportation systems within them, but you still got to drive to get there. But, if you go to Mount Rainier National Park, you do not need to rent a car to get to Rainier. There's transportation systems that will go there, bring you there. If you go to Yosemite, it connects to the regional transportation system and completely run around the valley in our free bus system. Zion National Park, we don't even allow cars in Zion anymore. It's all transportation system, very, very popular with the public. It's always interesting when we propose implementation of transportation system, we get howls and screams of, you're taking us away from our cars, and then they all love it once you put it in place. So it's always fascinating. But yes, in our urban parks, like Indiana Dunes, there was no stop for the public transportation at Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore. We finally got that fixed by working with public transportation. In New York City, with Jamaica Bay, we're working directly with the city of New York to link up transportation systems to get people out to this incredible resource that most people don't even know is a national park. Yes, sir.
Are there any threats to the national parks by oil and gas drilling?
I served 3 months as an incident commander on the Gulf oil spill. And all those pictures of oil on the beach, that was Gulf Islands National Seashore. Or on the Breton National Wildlife Refuge. And we're still picking up oil yes, there are threats, both in terms of adjacency, both on the terrestrial environment where there are oil and gas drilling going on. Fracking is a concern of ours because of the potential for gas to be released into water bodies in the parks as well. We do have a few parks that had pre-existing oil and gas rights, and so there are parks that actually still have oil and gas wells going on. Can't do any new ones, but they're pre-existing. And we, one of my sister agencies is the Bureau of Land Management, which licenses oil and gas on federal lands. And we work with them every day about where and how, when, and whether you can see it and what its potential impacts are on national parks. How many more?
Couple more.
2 more, and then we'll cut it off. Okay? Right over there.
Yes, you alluded to the...
Actually, wait a minute. Didn't you have one earlier? Did you have one? Oh, okay. No, go ahead then. Make sure that everybody gets 2.
You alluded to the issue of the problem between preserving species in a national park and perhaps taking a different position, stepping back and observing what happens in terms of the evolution of species. Can you describe a little more what the position is about preservation of species in the park?
Well, the Park Service in its evolution of its sort of management is that we don't we try to preserve systems rather than individual animals, and we try to save all the parts and let them sort of work together. Now we see that changing, and so if it's an endangered species, California condor, peregrine falcon, the gray wolf, then we go to heroic efforts, and we will reintroduce or we will do extraordinary things to protect the last of those and to captive breed and bring them back and all of that. But if it's not an endangered species, and the last thing you want it to do is to become endangered, then what you've got to do is accommodate it within the environment that we now recognize is changing. And it may be that species can no longer persist in your national park because the climate has changed. We got to figure out where it's going to go, and then begin to figure out what to protect and who should protect that new habitat. And if a new species shows up, I was driving through the Grand Canyon one day, and a group of javelinas ran across the road, and one of the rangers said, we didn't used to have javelinas here, and they've just arrived. The javelina is a wild pig, and they're cute, mean though. And so, I think that's the way we've got to start thinking about this, that things are changing, systems are shifting, and we've got to accommodate that. We can't stop it, we can't freeze it. Okay, one more. Oh, maybe not. Okay. Right.
So I think I remember this from a park we're starting to see birds migrate north earlier, that the Park Service actually had done a study and said that people were arriving at the parks a little earlier.
Phenology is affected the people too.
I was interested in it as a piece of science and looking at that, but apparently people have extended their sort of park visiting range and were coming earlier in this now.
I don't know. I'd love to see that, though. I think we have been marketing our parks for the shoulder seasons more effectively than in the past, and so people are coming in those windows to experience it in a different environment than in the past. But I don't know whether that's climate driven or economically driven or emotionally driven. So, well, thank you all. Great questions. Be careful out there. There's a big storm coming.